It's Wednesday, May the 20th, and welcome to Morning Message. Many years ago, when I was a theological student at Trinity College in Toronto, one of the professors there was named Howard Buckner. One of the courses that I took from Howard, and I really liked him as a professor, one of the courses I took from him was about preaching. And we did all sorts of practical things around preaching, including presentation and voice level and all those sorts of things. Part of the class requirement was to preach in front of him, and we would go into the chapel. It'd just be him and whoever it was that was to preach, and just take 5 minutes out of a sermon that you had prepared for your placement or whatever. And he would sit about halfway down the chapel and audio record your practice sermon. And it was a reel-to-reel tape recorder as well. I mean, it was really old-fashioned, kind of comical. Even for those days, it seemed very old-fashioned. So I preached 5 minutes out of a sermon, and I went back and I listened to Howard's advice, and he got to one point in the playback, and there was a word that I used. I don't remember what word it was, but he asked me what the word meant. And luckily, I knew it. It was some sort of theological word, and I gave him the definition of the word. And he said, "Oh, that's good, that's good. Next time, say that." So I always hear Howard's voice in my head when I think I'm getting a little bit too complicated in my sermons. His advice really was just to keep it simple, say things in ways that people are going to understand and appreciate. Having said that, I wanted to delve into something that perhaps is a little bit more theological than what I normally do in these morning messages. And that has to do with the idea of God being the ground of all being. This is a phrase that was really popularized by a theologian named Paul Tillich. And I'm not sure I can do justice to his particular explanation of this, but I think it stems from two ideas out of Hebrew Scripture. One is the idea that God's name can't be pronounced, or shouldn't be pronounced. And so a series of consonants became the way that it was written out. But that the word, the name for God couldn't or shouldn't be said. And then the other idea stems out of the encounter that Moses has with God. And when Moses asks, "Whom should I say send me?" The response, and it depends on how this is translated, is something along the lines of, "I am who I am." Sort of an inadequate answer for what Moses was looking for, but it speaks to this idea of God being the ground of all being. That really Paul Tillich is trying to get us beyond thinking about God as sort of a being that exists in heaven, but really being the thing in which all things are, and no thing at the same time. I don't want this to sound more complicated than it is, because it's not terribly complicated. It's really the idea that everything exists, everything we know exists within the ground of all being, and that is our God. And the nature of the ground of all being, this God that we proclaim, is love. I mean, that's kind of the constant message that you hear not only out of Scripture, but also from theologians like Paul Tillich. You can't really define something that's beyond everything else, but it does have characteristics. God does have characteristics, and primary amongst those characteristics is God's love. So I rarely quote Paul Tillich, or at least give him credit for the things that I might have said. And in a 10-minute sermon, okay, maybe 12-minute sermon, I I tend not to attribute quotes and get all kind of complicated like that. I'm just trying to keep it simple, the way that Howard Buckner would ask me to, and to kind of own what it is that I'm proclaiming in sermons and in morning messages like this. So the whole idea around thinking about God as the ground of all being is that there's nowhere we can go to escape being in God. God is all-encompassing. God is all around us. And so my hope for everyone today is that you feel that sense of God's presence, and even if you don't, that something inside of you this day reminds you that you are, I am, we all are, all that is, exists in God. And that God is a loving God. Amen.